right. So today's lesson is coming from Judges 6 and 11, verses 11 through 16, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. Um, we will talk about Judges 6 and 7 in its entirety, but for the focus point is just 11 through 16 because too many scriptures lose people. So starting at verse 11, it says, Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abizer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, Mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Sir, Gideon replied, If the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. But the Lord, Gideon replied, Gideon replied, How can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. The Lord said to him, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. So for tonight, for a simple short time, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk from the text or the subject, unqualified to win. So again, not going to be long, I promise. I'm actually making Brendan the host so that he can let people in, and that will not be a distraction for me. So before we start and really get into the weeds of the story, I really do think that it's important to kind of set the stage and context because Judges is a little bit of a complex book at times. And also there's a lot of things that are happening that I didn't read. So the book of Judges is really an interesting book. And some scholars refer to the stories in this book as the ugliest in the entire Bible. It's in this book that God uses the most unlikely heroes to lead his people to victory. And throughout the book of Judges, there is a common theme. Repeatedly, we find that the children of Israel or the Israelites have found their way into trouble. And while in this specific chapter, it doesn't state what exactly they've done to be deemed evil in God's eyes, we can deduct from a pattern in the other chapters that the Israelites were once again disobedient. Depending on what version of the Bible that you prefer to read, some translations start off verse 1 of chapter 6 with the word again. Again, the Israelites did evil in God's eyes. And it's this again that tells us that this is not the first go round with trouble for the Israelites. In fact, they've been in trouble time in and time in and time in again. In fact, throughout the book of Judges, every time the Israelites had a strong leader, they were committed to the Lord. They did what he asked, they were faithful. But as soon as the leader would die, their old habits would surface up to the top. They would start their sinful behaviors again, and as a result, they would then be chastised by God. God used those that were living around the Israelites to show them the true cost of their sins. And as per normal, the Israelites would then find themselves running to God, pleading for him to rescue them. But interestingly enough, they wanted to be rescued from the consequences of their actions. And doesn't that sound so familiar? But just as God does, he rescued his people and restored peace among them. And for some odd reason, they seem to be a fan of this cycle. And what is the cycle that I'm referencing? The cycle is peace, complacency, disobedience, distress, then deliverance. And I'm sure that if we took a moment to reflect, we would see that we've been perpetrators of this cycle in our own lives at some point. Some of us may be fans of it. Some of us see that it happens, ever so often. But nevertheless, the cycle has probably seen its way and reared its head into our lives. The Bible tells us that because the Israelites had done evil in the Lord's eyes, he handed this nation over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites, they were a dangerous and cruel group. They could have been considered savages, really. They were a group to be feared. The Midianites were so dangerous that the Israelites, they fled their own home. They fled their own land and went to go hide in caves and in the mountains. The Bible tells us that they hid in caves and dens because they were that much afraid. Imagine leaving your place of home, comfort, and just tranquility because you're so much afraid that someone that's come in and taken over your land is that dangerous. That's who they were. The Midianites, they can really be likened to savages, like, kind of what we saw on January 6th, those people that took over the Capitol. And it was really interesting. They're able to gather and rally support of the nations around. So it's almost like, it's almost like very reminiscent of that whole little like those people were able to rally the support from all over the country to come do their bad deeds on the Capitol on January 6th, just like the Midianites had been able to do so. And so what exactly did the Midianites do to the children of Israel that makes them so big and bad? The Bible says that when the Israelites planted their crop for harvest, raiders from Midian, Amalek, and the east, and the people of the east, as they're referred to in the Bible, would attack Israel. They would camp on the land, destroy as much as they could, and then after they attacked their crops, they would come in large numbers, and then they would take their animals. The text says that it was too many of the Midianites and these other allies that they had to count. And when the Lord gave dominion of the Israelites to Midian, he basically handed over the keys and let them take complete control. The Midianites stayed until there was absolutely nothing left. Some versions say their land was actually reduced to poverty. And so in verse 6, the children of Israel, they cried out for God's help. But in verse 8 and 9, God sends them a reminder of what he's already done for them by way of a prophet. The prophet reminds them that God had already rescued them from Egypt. He had already freed them from a life of slavery. He had already spared them from the brutality of Egypt and from their opposition. And in addition to saving them, he then gave them the land of their opposition. And in return, God asked for them to just do one thing. He asked that they not worship the gods that the nations around them worship. They were surrounded by pagan nations. And so these pagan nations worship gods and idols. And he said, our jealous God, I'll give you all of this. I'll free you. I'll save you. I'll bless you. All I want you to do is just worship me and only me. So that took care of verses 1 through 11. And now 1 through 10. And now we're at the text for tonight, Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 16. And the first point that I have for you is a very simple reminder. One, it's not profound, it's not deep, it's not, out of this world, theological. It's just me telling you that God didn't create us to operate in fear. We have Gideon, who's threshing wheat in a wine press. And I'm not sure if you're really familiar with what the threshing process of wheat looks like or what that entails, because we're really far removed from that process. But the threshing process loosens the edible part of grain from the chaff or the husk that it is attached to. What we're used to seeing when we plant like fields of wheat, that's the chaff and the husk. And there are little bitty edible grains that are a part of that. And there's a process to separate that apart. We as humans are not able to digest the chaff, so it's imperative that wheat goes through this process to be separated. The process begins when someone beats the grain using a stick tied to another stick to separate the edible from the inedible. This process would usually take place on a threshing floor, which is simply just a flattened outdoor surface exposed to wind. The wind would then blow the chaff or the husk, while the heavier grain that's edible stays on the floor. Then a farmer comes up, then picks the grain up, and then it goes through the cleansing process. So Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press and not on a threshing floor where it's supposed to be done. During this time, a wine press was a square or circular pit carved into rock where grapes are crushed for the wine process. So simply, all I'm trying to let you know is that he's in a pit expecting to be productive. The threshing process was designed to be done in an open space on a hard and flat surface, not in a dark and confined pit in the ground. Gideon was so afraid of being captured by the Midianites or the possibility of them taking his grain as they had done before, that he went to every extent to hide, even if it meant making the process harder than it had to be. Fear put him in this pit. Fear altered his perspective. And it's the same fear that he could have been that allowed him to think that he could be productive in this pit. And I don't know if you all remember that saying, fear, F-E-A-R, fear is the false evidence appearing real. I hated that quote. But it's very much true, because I don't know about you, but this whole section of the story is basically telling me that fear allowed Gideon to think that there was some way, somehow, going to be opportunity for him to be successful in getting this edible food in the most unsuccessful predicament, because that's all the only options he had. Fear allowed him to be afraid and to do things that were not supposed to be done in the manner that they were not created to be done in. I have decided, though, for me personally, that I can't be like Gideon. I can't let things that scare me alter my perspective. I can't let them place me in a pit. I can't let the things that happen in 2020 scare me into being fearful in 2021. I can't allow my fear to stop me from being bold in my faith. And I won't allow my fear to dictate my decisions, nor will I allow it to paint my perspective. Because 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7 tells us, for God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and of a good mind. And so for the second point for tonight, I want us to know that unlike us, God's faithfulness never wavers. Remember, Gideon is threshing the wheat in the winepress when an angel of the Lord appears to him and says in verse 12, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. In 7 words in this verse 12, the angel of the Lord affirms God's identity, and then the angel of the Lord affirms Gideon's identity in God and then confirms God's promise for Gideon. How does the angel of the Lord affirm Gideon's identity? We've already seen in this text just how fearful Gideon is. We just learned that his fear is literally paralyzing him in his mindset, that he's altering his ability to do things and be successful so much because he does not want to be captured. He does not want his stuff to be taken. He does not want to be he doesn't want to interact with the Midianites at all cost. And yet an angel of the Lord calls Gideon a mighty hero. Some translations even read a mighty warrior. Now, mind you, an angel is an official spokesperson for the Lord. So, Brendan, that's a reminder for you because you're a communications major. You would be a spokesperson for the Lord if you were an angel. But thank God you are not. No, I'm just playing. They can only say what the Lord has directed them to say. So when the angel calls Gideon a mighty hero or a mighty warrior, we know that the Lord is saying this is how he sees Gideon. He sees him as this mighty hero or this mighty warrior. The angel of the Lord calls Gideon mighty, courageous, or powerful, depending on what version of the Bible that you're reading. And it's not because Gideon has shown evidence of being courageous or a mighty hero. No, God sends this message through the angel because he knows what Gideon can be if he would just trust him. Some of us are so deep in our own fear that we never hear what God is calling us to be or understand how he sees us. We can't get past our own shortfalls to see our God-given capacity. And this is how Gideon is. God would not have addressed Gideon as a hero or a warrior if he had not been equipped to do so. God had already made a promise to the children of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy that he would go with them, fight for them, and give them the victory in battle. Excuse me. I don't know about you, but I feel like I can relate to Gideon myself. Here he is being assured in verse 12 by an angel of the Lord that God is with him. But as we read in verse 13, Gideon is really feeling like, I hear what you're saying, God, but your words aren't matching my experience. I hear that you're telling me everything is and will be okay, but we're going through it and there isn't a sign of you anywhere. Or maybe it's just a simple, there's no way on God's earth that he's actually here and we're living like this. There's no way that the God that I serve will allow this to happen. But in verse 13, Gideon is asking God, he wants to know, why is this happening to them? Where are the miracles that their ancestors told them about? Is this the same God that delivered his ancestors out of Egypt? Now, I would imagine at this point, Gideon is 2 seconds away from, excuse me, is 2 seconds away from really just walking away from his faith. Here he is threshing wheat in a wine press, fearful after his people have had to flee their land, hide in caves because God allowed this to happen to them. He allowed the Midianites to come in and take control. His life has been turned upside down and every bit of comfort that he's been used to has been removed from his life. And an angel of the Lord is coming to tell him that God is with him. I imagine that he's thinking that there's no way a God in heaven would sit back and watch his people suffer like this. Has anybody tonight ever felt abandoned by God? Have you ever felt like you were in this dark place and there was no light to guide you out? Have you ever felt like the promise and predicament were polar opposite? God is promising you that everything is going to be okay, but all hell is breaking loose. He's promising you that you will be successful, but yet you're failing at wherever you are right now in life. He promised that you would be here, X, Y, and Z, but you're still back at A. That's how Gideon felt. And this is the place that Gideon was at. He felt as though God had forgotten about his people. The Lord allowed Midian to rule over the people, the children of Israel, for 7 whole years. Midian literally means strife. The Lord turned over power to a group whose very name meant strife or a vigorous fight. And it's interesting that never does Gideon, throughout this entire text, take responsibility for what caused them to get into this place. From the moment Midian took control over their land, the Israelites have made no effort to place blame where it actually belongs, which is on themselves. And I just want to pause for a second and ask, how many of us are guilty of doing the same thing, blaming God and asking, how can he abandon us, when in fact, we're really just reaping the consequences of the soul of the seeds that we've planted. I think a lot of times that we get so used to God's grace and mercy, we're so used to him saving us that we forget that there are consequences to our actions, that God will allow bad things to happen at times, not because he doesn't love us, not because he doesn't care for us, but simply sometimes you have to learn better than you can be told. And so I hope that we would learn from the Israelites. I hope that we would not live a life that we have to have the Midianites come and take over our own personal life. But if we do, it's okay. God is still there for you. God is still faithful. God does not waver. Gideon and his people thought that they could be disobedient and still experience the luxuries of God's favor. And when the luxuries were stripped away from them, they blamed God for the chastisement that they've endured. Mind you, they experienced less than really what they deserve, because we serve a God of grace and mercy. We know that the Bible tells us that the wages of our sin is death. And so no matter how you try to justify it, shake it, shape it, and tape it, disobedience is a sin, and they were disobedient, and so they really deserve to die. And yet God only gave control over to the Midianites. He only stripped them from the things that they were so used to. He didn't kill them as though they so rightfully deserved, but God repeatedly steps in and saves them from themselves and extends grace that was not deserved or earned. And just like the children of Israel, God has continued to extend grace time after time after time to us. We should be glad that we serve a God that shows us grace even when we don't learn our lesson the first, second, or the third time. We should be glad that we serve a God that extends grace with no strings attached. You want to know what else is so great about our God? He has given us everything that we need. Gideon struggled with the report from the angel. The angel told him that the Lord was with him. But when we read verse 14, we see that the Lord himself starts to talk to him. So originally it's the angel. Now it's the Lord, because the Lord needs to let him know, this is how I feel. You don't believe my angel? Let me tell you myself. So verse 14 reads, then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. Even with this response from God, Gideon was so focused on his own inabilities that he couldn't see what God was telling him. In verse 15, he asked God, how can he be the one that rescues Israel when he's the least in his family and his family is the weakest in their clan? But interestingly enough, God doesn't rebut his Gideon's points in verse 15. He doesn't say, you know what, you bring up some valid arguments. Let me reshape my whole plan. Let me redo this. Let me send somebody else. No, God doubles down and he restates his promise in verse 16. In verse 16, the Lord says to him, I will be with you and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting one man. This suggests that Gideon lacked not just confidence in himself, but he really lacked confidence in God. In verse 12, we see the angel saying that the Lord is with him. In verse 14, we see the Lord saying, I'm the one who's sending you. And in verse 16, he says, I will be with you. God is literally reassuring Gideon, you've got all that you need. I've given you all that you could possibly need to be victorious. And yet Gideon is still so very doubtful. And what's interesting is that the Lord doesn't tell Gideon that he will supply him with more and more and give him an abundance of tools to fight his battle. He's not saying that he'll give him the latest technologies and weapons so that he can, have all of these, glorious moments. No, the Lord is simply telling him, go with the strength that I've already given you, and I will be by your side. In a sense, the Lord is saying, I don't need to give you more when what I've already given you is just enough. He's telling Gideon that I've written the story and I know exactly how it's going to end. And just as he has written Gideon's story, he's written your story and he's also written mine. He wants us to remember that he is with us. He wants us to remember who we are in him. He wants us to remember who he is, but he also wants us to know that he's never going to send us in a situation without knowing how it'll end. And we know that God promises that we will be victorious, that we will be successful, that he already has a plan for us, one for us to succeed and not to fail. The journey may not always be easy, but the end of the road will always have victory for us. Because remember in Romans 8:31, it says, if God is for us, who can be against us? But family and friends, I would like to tell you how this story ends because it gets good. If you keep reading into chapter 6 and 7, Gideon is still doubtful that he's the one to lead his people to victory. He asks God and the angel at multiple points in this story, but for a total of 3 signs. And God and the angel do just that. God tells Gideon to gather his people to create an army. Gideon is able to pull together an army of 32,000 to fight the Midianites. And the Lord tells Gideon, you have way too many people. If I let you win with the 32,000, you'll take credit for really what I've done. I need you to cut your number down. Tell the people who are afraid to go home. And so 22,000 people, which cuts his army down from 32,000 to 10,000. God tells Gideon, even with 10,000, you still got way too many people. Here's what I want you to do. Take your people to the water and I'll narrow it down from there. So Gideon takes his people to the water and God tells Gideon, separate your people into 2 groups. If at the water they cup their hands and drink like dogs, go to one side. But if they get on their knees and at the water they drink directly from their face, go to the other side. God instructs Gideon to send the ones who put their face on the water on their knees home, and the ones that drank from their hands like a cup, like dogs, keep them. That'll be your army. His army is then reduced from the 32,000 to the 10,000, and now we're just at a mere 300. And God literally reduces Gideon's army down to the bare bones, because remember, we've learned that God didn't create us to operate in fear. So he sent those that were afraid home. He's also already given us what we've needed, and his faithfulness will never waver. So even with the bare minimum, he's still got everything under control. He doesn't have to give you excess for you to succeed, but I'll get back to the story. Gideon collected all of the supplies that the people that had been sent home had. He collects their supplies and he sends them to about their merry way. And he takes his 300 to position, which is right above the Midian camp. So basically the Midianites are in the bottom, like in a valley, and they're at the top of this hill. And the night that they're supposed to go to battle, he tells Gideon, take your servant and go down to the Midianite camp. He said, I've already given you the victory, Gideon, but if you're still having doubts, go down and listen to what they're saying. And once you hear what they've got to say, you'll realize that you've already won. So Gideon takes his servant, goes down to the camp, and right as they arrive, there's a man telling his friend about a dream that he had just had. And when the man tells the friend about the dream, the friend then says, your dream can only mean one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite, victory over Midian and all of its allies. And so as soon as Gideon hears this, he immediately drops to his feet and he begins to worship God for the victory that was to come. Gideon returns to his army and tells them that they will be victorious over Midian and that it was their time. So he gathers his men, he divides them into 3 groups, and he tells them to surround the Midianite camps and do as he does. They blow their horns and they hold their torches in their hands, and they shout a sword for God and for Gideon. And when they shouted, they scared the Midianites. And when they blew their horns, God has the swords that the Midianites are holding themselves he has them turn it against each other, and they begin to kill each other. So before Gideon and his people even move and go down into the camp, God is already giving them victory in motion. And so the Bible says that those that weren't killed by each other, they ran for their lives as far as they could get. And Gideon and his men, they captured the leaders of the Midianite camp. Remember, the Midianites are, the word Midian literally means strife. God gives them victory to people that were meant to cause them harm, that were meant to destroy them. So God took Gideon, who was incapable and inexperienced, unfit, unskilled, unqualified, or whatever word you can think of to describe him. He takes him to lead a small army to be victorious over the Midianites, whose name literally means vigorous fight. Maybe you're feeling like a Gideon. You feel like God is telling you to do something that seems too big and too great for you to be able to manage. Maybe there's a battle that's looming for you that you know that you have to go into, but you just don't understand how you can be victorious. Or maybe there's a task that just seems like it's impossible for you to do. Remember, Gideon was the weakest in his family, who was the weakest in the clan. He's the weakest of the weak, and yet he was still victorious. And the beauty of it all, God didn't give Gideon a lot. God was with him every step of the way. He had already given him just what he needed. God had given Gideon him. God made it possible for an unqualified leader to win. And just as he did with Gideon, he can do the same thing for you. So keep fighting, keep pushing, and keep trusting. There's this video that I found on Instagram that me and Brendan share with each other from time to time. And it's of a pastor that's in Virginia. And he says, after you finish crying, get up and keep going. If you're battling a situation, get up and keep going. And if you feel like you're under pressure, turn your pressure into praise and keep going. Be like Gideon, keep going. Even if it doesn't make sense, keep going. Even if it doesn't feel like it'll be victorious, it'll be a successful situation, keep going, because at the end of the day, God is giving you everything that you need. And if you're trying to figure out what is that he's given me, he's given you access to him. We no longer have to talk to God through different people. We are not Catholic, not knocking Catholics, but we don't have to go through all of these different saints and angels. We get access directly to God because of Jesus. And so if you ever are fearful, or if you're doubtful, or you're scared, or you're nervous, go to God, seek him in prayer, ask him for guidance. But remember, he's already made you victorious in whatever battle is to come. And so you just have to get up and keep going. And so for me, saints, that's all I have. I pray that you stay encouraged. I pray that you remember that you may be unqualified, but he's already destined you to win. And that's all I have.
Amen.
Oh, well, y'all, I really get tired of leading Bible study. It's so draining sometimes. It's fun, but it's exhausting. But I pray that you all were blessed. Are there any comments, questions, thoughts, reflections? Wow, such a quiet.
I would say this. I would say, when we don't have to have access or like, as you would say, excessive things, I can certainly speak to that, because at some point, when I first moved here in 2007, I had saved up $1,400, and I thought that was enough to really get me going, but I had to put all of that down to move into my apartment, right?
Yeah.
The next day, my car broke down. Okay. And I didn't have anything, but what I found out is that he answered me, and the Lord was with me, because even when I was I broke down at this place off of Cherry Point, I don't even know where this place was. I'm new to the